want to start with the overview of what we were talking about in the last class, which is an introduction of the idea of culture, but not necessarily as something so profound in itself, but in some ways what anthropologists were arguing against at the time. And so the idea that I'm borrowing from Michel Trouillot is that culture is an anti-concept. It's something that anthropologists used to speak against some of the predominant views that were in place at the time. So if we rewind to about 500 years ago, or about 1500 Common Era, 1500 AD, for those of us who I guess, well, we just had a big celebration around that religious moment. But 1500 in the Common Era, about 500 years ago, what we see if we looked across the world is a wide range of diverse and complex societies. And all the things that we talked about in chapter 6 of Levin and Schultz and chapter 7 of Levin and Schultz in terms of different forms of political organization, states, bands, chiefdoms, tribes, different forms of food gathering, hunting and gathering, agriculture, horticulture, pastoralism, all of those things were in operation. And in some ways there wasn't, I mean, in various areas of the world, there would be these empires that would rise up and maybe take over different places and spawn their own forms, and they'd perhaps fall again. And so there was a lot of political dynamism, and there wasn't one sweeping empire that sort of had dominated the world as such. There were these smaller empires that have tremendous regional influence, but they weren't transoceanic empires. And so we talked about how a number of societies that really for a long time in human history were not at the forefront of human history, in the sense that they weren't the places that you would go to see the most powerful cities and the most dynamic things that were going on. They were relative backwaters in the scope of what was going on, especially in Eurasia, and even in when the Spaniards showed up in places like the Inca Empire and with the Aztecs, they were often amazed at the life that was being lived and the ways that people were able to amass these massive cities and agricultural networks. It was often a stunning technological and political achievement. So these places that were not really necessarily at the forefront of world history turned themselves into the first transoceanic or global empires, places that were knitting together previous trade networks and establishing new trade networks and new hierarchies of people, moving people from one continent to another. We talked about the influx of silver from South America and from what is now Central America and Mexico, and also the cultivation of sugarcane, the massive movement of peoples, the massive decimation of native populations, and the massive influx of enslaved Africans set up a whole new way of being in the world in some ways. When we get to the 19th century, or about 150 or 200 years ago, and the Europeans would then look out over at this diversity, and in some ways what they did was they explained why people were different by naturalizing the hierarchy that they themselves had created. I'm going to use this word naturalizing. We'll see it again, I think, in chapter 15 or 14 or 15 of Levin and Schultz. It's the idea that you take something that is social or is something that is cultural, and you try to explain it as if it were God-given or natural or part of the order of things. And so what the explanations were for why people were different were rooted in this idea that, well, that's the way it always is, or that's evolution, or that's the natural hierarchy of the world. And so when anthropologists introduced this idea of culture, and again, it's a word that pre-existed anthropology, they borrowed it and they retooled it or reimagined it. And basically what they were doing is trying to say, no, people aren't different because of their race or because of their natural environment. They're different because of this other thing, which is the learned behaviors, the learned patterns of culture. And so this was a way of talking against, and again, it isn't that anthropologists were any wonderful people at the time. A lot of them were completely buying into the hierarchies that existed. But in general, a number of people began to speak out against this idea that the human population should be organized into better and worse and primitive and developed and civilized and savage. And so basically what anthropology was saying is those hierarchies and those categories aren't given in nature. They weren't put in place by some sort of divine ordering. They're in place because of human society and human culture. And so it leads to the idea that you should be careful of judging the differences that you see in the world and always going around trying to eliminate people who are different. And so if somebody is different either individually or socially, there was a lot of, and perhaps still is a lot of prejudice against people who are in some way different from the norm. And so the anthropologist Ruth Benedict, one of the first anthropologists, student of Franz Boas, author of The Patterns of Culture, which is a best-selling book, came out first in 1934, was sold around the world, and was really one of the books most responsible for introducing the term culture into the American life and later globally as well. And so this was their statement about what anthropology is up to, that it's not simply the scientific cataloging of all these strange peoples and strange customs, but it's to help us to understand others and to understand ourselves in a way that we can then be more tolerant toward the views of other people. And so, again, this is a summary statement for what many anthropologists consider to be a guiding purpose of the discipline in some way. So that leads us into, or for me it leads us into, an article by the anthropologist Meredith Small, a rather famous article in some ways in that it's a small version of a book that she wrote of the same title called Our Babies Ourselves. And basically what she's doing here is taking this notion of different cultural patterns and applying it to something that people feel extremely strongly about, which is parenting and how you raise babies. And so we start off in the very first part with the Gusii of sub-Saharan Africa. The little box there is called Gusii Survival Skills by Robert Levine. And basically, back in the day, he showed the Gusii mothers, some video of US women dealing with their infants. And he reports that, they're shocked, they're appalled, and they conclude that the American women are incompetent mothers. They don't know what they're doing. And the same thing perhaps could be said if we watched a video of different societies. And so the idea is that, one person's great parenting practice is seen as incompetent to another. that, in some ways, the Gusii had a very different way of caring for their young. I just want to pause here for a second and say that a number of you in the comments got very sad about the infant mortality rate here among these people and in sub-Saharan Africa. And it was a very high infant mortality rate. I want to pause there for a second just to say that that high infant mortality rate was not due to some sort of cultural practice of parenting. If you kind of go back in time to 100 years ago, the US infant mortality rate was very similar to the one we see here. And for us, I think growing up in this country, for the most part, we see, the death of an infant is a terrible tragedy. And it probably always has been, but 100 or 200 years ago, it was something that would probably happen with some regularity. And so if you were going to be a parent, you would in some ways expect to lose a child or an infant. I'm not saying you would. I mean, it isn't that expect is perhaps the wrong word. It wouldn't be unusual. It wouldn't be of the same caliber. A lot of people outliving your own, at least today, I think, for the most part, we usually believe that we are going to, that our children are going to outlive us. And it's sad if it doesn't happen. In the old days, and still in many other countries, it is not uncommon for people to outlive some of their own children. And so I guess I'm just trying to say that because to put this in a little bit of perspective, that in some ways, the things that account for infant mortality are not so much what we might call cultural things as they are early childhood vaccinations, especially clean water, and having enough food and access to health care, which we'll talk about are not really something that you would classify as a cultural or parenting practice. So that's them. They also talk about the Dutch here, or Harkness and Super do, Sarah Harkness and Charles Super. And the Dutch example I really like a lot as well, in part because, not that the Dutch are culturally closer to us, but in some ways, sometimes when we read about things in sub-Saharan Africa, we might think, well, that's far away, whereas this is a European society that has this idea of the 3 R's: rest, regularity, and the word in Dutch for cleanliness also starts with an R. And so they call them the 3 R's, which then translate into actually a biological difference in how long the Dutch children sleep and the way in which they are raised, so that we can see that in some ways, even across what we might call related cultural patterns in the Europeans and in the Americas, you see that there can be a difference in how people view children, which can come out as a biological difference. And so one of the main points of this article is trying to get us to get out of our sense of being ethnocentric, or thinking our way of doing things is automatically the right way and the only way to do things. And so to try and take a little bit of a culturally relative dose here about the way in which we raise kids. And as I said, this is something that people get really excited about or very agitated about, in part because when you're trying to care for an infant, it's very intense. And so people get very emotional and tend to be quite critical during this time, perhaps because they're so sleep deprived during this session. But what Meredith Small is trying to do, and it resulted in a whole field of medical practice, which is called Ethnopediatrics, is trying to be culturally sensitive to the ways in which different people raise children and how they might handle some of these major issues that come up when infants are doing their infant thing. And so one of the issues is, well, what do you do when the infant is crying? Do you automatically run over and hold them and cuddle them all the time? Or do you have this sort of scheduled time in which, okay, time to go to bed, time to cry that out, go to sleep through the night, hopefully. So is that something, are you going to put the kid on a schedule from the beginning, or do you just respond automatically whenever they cry? Same thing with feeding. Wow, people get really upset about this one. I don't know if you've seen in our own society the debates about where you can feed your infant, how long you should be breastfeeding, etc. There's a box from the biological anthropologist Catherine Detweiler about these ideas about when you should wean a child. Should it be at what point in time, how you should do it, what kind of food they should have. Like I said, this gets very, very sensitive across different societies and within different societies. Of course, sleeping. How much sleep are you going to get, and where, and who? James McKenna has argued for the importance of co-sleeping with infants. This has been something that others in the US society have said is not a good idea because they think it is responsible for some of the sudden infant death syndrome. McKenna claims that, in fact, if done correctly, that this kind of co-sleeping, especially with an infant in the first few months, is enormously important because it helps to regulate the heartbeat and the breathing of the infant. And for those of you who've spent time next to an infant of up to 3 months old, it is one of the strangest things because they really are not regulated at all in terms of, even their breathing is kind of a little bit, can be kind of herky-jerky, but when they're next to you, you fall into a rhythm with them, and your heartbeat and your breathing tend to coordinate, and it kind of smooths out. It's a really strange thing because you think, you wonder what's going on with this kid, and they, in some ways, they need that human social contact in order to coordinate and get the breathing and heartbeat together. We talked about this in the last class a tiny bit. That what are people trying to do when they put their kids into different rooms and give them big strollers? And what value are they trying to inculcate? As I think Teamer said, independence, right? We believe that our infant should be independent, and that should happen as soon as possible. And so there's a whole kinds of, putting them on a schedule, trying to wean them early, making them sure they sleep in their own crib or their own room, is part of a value system which puts an emphasis on this idea of the individual and values that. I don't know if it really works, but we try to say it does. So on the one level, this article can be read as a plea for not necessarily cultural relativism, but less ethnocentrism when it comes to child rearing habits. But I also love this article because it talks to us about how culture gets so deep into our biology, you might say. And so it's really also an article about the process of how we learn our social social life gets under our skin, or what we've called in this class biocultural, a biocultural perspective where our cultural practices are entwined with our biology, or holism in the sense that these things are interconnected. They are not unrelated and separate. So Meredith Small makes the point that because of bipedalism, and because we have basically large-brained infants that need to come out of a birth canal, humans are born with their brains still to develop, what she calls neurologically unfinished. And so we add on an enormous amount of head and brain growth outside of the womb. And so, I mean, again, if you've spent much time around an infant from 0 to 3 months, it's a phase in life like nothing else, in the sense that there's no schedule to it. Everything is going on all at once. And so what Small is saying is during these crucial infant times, even something like breathing and heart rates are done with others, are done in social contact with others. We aren't able to do much of anything. And so our brains are wiring up. They're adding on all these neurons. They're physically growing during a time that we're being intensely nurtured, carried around, unable to do anything for ourselves, is also the time that we are developing our brains and absorbing all this cultural stuff. And so I believe if done correctly, if you think about this idea that we sometimes have, you may have heard about, well, is it nature or is it nurture? Is it nature or is it culture? That's often portrayed as some sort of dichotomy, as some sort of separation. And if we do the holism thing correctly, we're going to ask ourselves if there's really a dichotomy between these two, because they're all happening together at the same time as we are growing and developing. And so for anthropologists, I believe we would say there's no such thing as a human nature that occurs outside of whatever society, whatever culture, whatever history you're bringing to the table. You become human in a particular way. There's no human that's kind of the basic human, and then you add on Spanish to the basics. No, we grow up in a particular language or languages. We grow up in a particular place. That's how we become who we are. We don't just add on the culture stuff later. And so what that also means, I think, is that you can't say, oh, well, this is the way you should parent. All of these things over thousands, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, thousands of years, let's say, have grown up in different environments, with different values, with different social systems, with different food ways. And so there's not one way that makes sense to raise kids. There's a lot of different ways because of human political, economic, cultural diversity. There's a lot of different ways that could make sense. It doesn't mean every way is all great. Don't get me wrong. There are some things you don't want to do. But there's a lot of different things that can work and do work in parenting. And so I hope this article gives us some perspective on sort of the cultural relativism part of parenting, but also this idea of how culture, how we get enculturated into a certain environment.